Hey, Brady, I got a question for you about Michigan. If they played that game against Georgia the first or second weekend of December instead of the last day of the year, do you think it's a different game, or do you think Michigan was completely outmanned? What did they do wrong? Or is it just a night and day, men against the boys?
I thought they did a tremendous job of trying to eliminate Aidan Hutchinson and David Ajabo from really impacting and creating any negative plays. That was one of the first things. And when you go back and watch that tape, watch how many times they would leave Aidan unblocked, but then pull someone around. And they have one of those 330-pound huge offensive line would just slam into them. And it was like time and time and time again. And the way they focused on them, the way they took care of them up front, Jamari Sawyer, he did a heck of a job on the left side the entire game. That's one of those things that, like, you better believe going into it, the entire game plan that week was about trying to limit. They've got that hat, that wherever Aidan Hutchinson's at, or that jersey he's wearing, wherever he's at, you're going to see 97. They're focusing on where he's at and trying to get hits on him, trying to beat him up. I mean, it seemed like that was their objective, and it ended up working out. I don't know if the timing of the game would have mattered quite as much. I mean, again, I think if those teams play 10 times again, you're not going to see as much physical dominance as you saw from Georgia. I think, Michigan just didn't really have as good of a showing. But, again, that's the first time getting to the playoff. I think you've seen that from a number of teams. They get there for the first time. I mean, Notre Dame's battled that. I mean, really, basically every team, when we've seen, there's been some blowouts in the semifinal games. That's just how
Right.
they worked out. But I do think if they would have played again, a couple of weeks from now, you probably would have seen a different result in the game, or at least a closer game between those two.
Does the shine come off Aidan Hutchinson and David Ajabo after that game? Did they take a step back NFL draft-wise? What's your take on those guys?
No, I don't think so. I think, from the people I talk to, the conversation about Aidan Hutchinson is you're obviously going to look at his entire body of work, and he's a tremendous player. So no one's going to take that away from him. A lot of people try to make, well, hey, playing against an SEC team, going up against NFL players. Well, yeah, dude, look what he did against the Ohio State tackles. Those guys are NFL players in the future too. So, let's just not look at one game or look at a vacuum and draw too many conclusions. I think the more interesting debate and conversation you get is whether it's Aidan Hutchinson to David Ajabo or Aidan Hutchinson to Kayvon Thibodeau, is you hear guys talk about, like, upside. And for whatever reason, they kind of feel like, hey, like, Aidan's kind of where he's at. And they feel like David Ajabo has maybe a little bit more upside. They feel like Kayvon Thibodeau maybe has a little more upside. I'm not sure why, but that's like the narrative that I hear sometimes. And I think it's going to be interesting as we get closer to the draft, if you don't hear more people kind of making those comments or talking about that, like, hey, what's his upside? Is he already as good of a player as he's going to be? Or we're going to see him take that next step when he gets to the NFL level too.
Brady Quin with us. Brady Quin, Fox college football analyst, of course, Fox Sports Radio as well. Brady, I wanted to ask you about Nick Saban. He's 70 years old. The guy's won 7 national championships. Right.
It does.
Got a chance for 8 tonight. I mean, look, I looked last week. I think Bobby Bowden coached till he was 80.
70, yeah.
How long do you think Nick Saban wants to do this, especially in the world of this NIL? And we can make all the jokes we want about, well, Alabama's been paying players for years. It's legal now. But nonetheless,
Freedom of Information Act.
Right. How much longer do you think a guy like Nick Saban wants to do this?
It's a great question, and I kind of look at it and think, you got guys like Bill Belichick, Pete Carroll are still coaching a long time. They've, when they have so much success, it's like, all right, I guess you asked the question, at what point is it enough?
Yes.
Is this national championship going to be enough? I think the one thing as a coach in that position is you got to wonder too when you're recruiting these kids, what you're telling them, because given his age. Does he foresee him coaching out some of these players he's recruiting to the end of their time there? I mean, that's a big question that I think a lot of parents and players would want to know if they're choosing to go to the University of Alabama and go play for Nick Saban. That's a big piece of all this. I think we all kind of think in the back of our minds, like, hey, when Nick Saban leaves Alabama, like, this thing's wide open then. It kind of falls apart. We don't expect him to be as successful. Maybe that won't be the case, but I think that's what everyone's thinking in the back of their mind. So, I think as long as he's successful and having fun doing it, it doesn't look like he's 70, I'll tell you that much. For a guy who seems to be as stressed out all the time and gets as angry as he does at the officials and sometimes his players, The guy doesn't look 70. So it's probably easier when you're winning all those national championships too to make it feel worthwhile. But I don't know. He also strikes me as the type, like kind of like a Bill Snyder, where the guy could very well coach till he's 80. And he could do this for a long time because they love what they do. They love impacting young men. They love trying to win championships and the competitiveness. And you hear some coaches who are lifers where they feel like once they give it up, they feel like, what are they really living for? So I could still see him doing it for at least 5 more years, especially at the rate he's going.
I think he's entered another level of conversation if he wins this one. And what I mean by that is right now, John Wooden's still the guy. When you think about guys, it's John Wooden, what he was able to do at UCLA, Red Auerbach, what he was able to do with the Celtics. Like, those are the guys that set the gold standard. But this win, in terms of a team that, like, the eras in which he won in the BCS era. He won in the playoff era a couple of times. Now he's going to win potentially tonight. I think he is. Now he'll win in the playoff/NIL era. Nobody has been able to maintain like that for 20 years. But speaking of coaches, tell me about Marcus Freeman. You guys got Marcus Freeman. They did move him up to the head coach. Like, what can he add that maybe your boy Kelly didn't have?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just the relationships that he's been able to develop over the course of a year with the players. It went viral when they announced him officially as the head coach. You saw everyone erupt in the locker room, and that's just the feeling that, he's given players, and the players have given him as far as the connection he's made in just a year's time. So he's able to connect with them, I think, on a deeper level. And it seems odd because we talk about NIL, we talk about all these other things that players are focused on, but at the end of the day, it's still football. It's still about winning championships. It's still about growing and developing as a player, as a young man, and I think that's where he connects to them on a real base. And so he brings a lot of energy. He brings a lot of passion for the sport, and I think he connects with them in a real way. And he can talk to different guys in the team and be able to relate to them, which is, I think, harder and harder to do in college football anymore. I was talking to a past college football coach, one of the best, and he was saying, I think it's really becoming a young man's sport now with the way recruiting's nonstop, especially now with the transfer portal. And I think the types of young men now that you're getting, it's different than what it was 2 decades ago. The way you could talk to a player, the way you could coach a player, all those things have changed in a big way. And I think you got to be able to adapt and change. And if you can't, you better be successful, right? Like, you better be able to be like a Nick Saban type where if you're one of those guys that's going to get on a guy and be hard on a player, you better be able to have success and after, because the second you don't have success, it's going to be hard to keep those guys to be playing with you or playing for you through some of those rough times. So I think, Notre Dame could have found itself lightning in a bottle. It's still a big job considering, he hasn't had any head coaching experience before. Even if he had 20 years of head coaching experience, a guy like Brian Kelly, for example, it's still a big job. So there'll be some learning on the job. I think he probably learned a little bit too, just from the Fiesta Bowl and how the first half went versus the second half. But I think he's got a tremendous amount of upside.
Hey, Brady, whether it's Notre Dame, Michigan, Michigan State, insert team not in the SEC here. We hear Jim Harbaugh rumors going back to the NFL, or at least entertaining the idea. For whatever reason, this year it feels more real because you've got all these guys in the transfer portal now. You've got all of these guys. You sign somebody in recruiting, and that's not the end of it. Now you're recruiting these guys each and every year, freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, just to stay with your program. Maybe a guy like Jim Harbaugh doesn't want to do that anymore. So I don't know. Two-part question. Number one, do you think Jim Harbaugh's legitimately looking at the NFL because of the way college football is going now? And two, can a team like Notre Dame, Michigan, or Michigan State, whoever, really compete in today's college football world? Ohio State in 2014, the last national championship outside of an SEC team, and then Clemson.
Yeah. No, look, to answer your last question, I do think they can. I think that it takes the right combination of factors. And obviously recruiting is the lifeblood of every college football program. And Alabama's dominated that over the past decade. I think they've had 8 of the last 10 number 1 classes in recruiting. Now, Texas A&M has, the number 1 recruiting class, I believe, in 2022 or whatever. And that had a lot to do with NIL and paying players a considerable amount to get that done. And so we'll see what happens moving forward. But the reality is players want two things when they come and play college football: a chance to win a national championship, and I think a chance to go to the NFL. Maybe now money factors into that, but regardless of what these kids are getting paid for NIL deals, it's still not going to be as much as what they'll make at the NFL level. So we haven't jumped the shark quite yet and got to that point. But to answer the Harbaugh question, I think every college football coach, if they're given the opportunity to speak to an NFL team or interviewed by an NFL team, is probably debating it because of some of the reasons you talked about. I mean, we're in the wild, wild west right now in college football. There really is no governance or governing body over NIL or trying to make a window for these kids, at least to commit more than a year to a team. I mean, at any point in time, they can put their name in the transfer portal. That doesn't mean they're going to leave, but it does essentially lead you to believe that tampering can happen, meaning, to your point, you've got to keep recruiting the guys on your own roster. The kids can pick up and leave at any point in time, free pass to utilize that portal. So there are some things where I think we need more structure. We probably need some sort of oversight. I'm not advocating for the NCAA, but maybe the Group of Five and Power Five get together, or just the Power Five get together, and they anoint a commissioner, and they try to get together to put some more clear ground rules as far as how we're going to handle this moving forward. But look, the reality is we can't even get the Power Five conferences to agree upon expansion. And if that's the case, how are we going to be able to agree upon other stuff like NIL and everything else? I mean, it seems like we're in a time and day and age in our country where we can't seem to agree upon much. So I'm not holding my breath on that one. But I do think, to your point, it's become such a difficult task now of how you go about building your roster in college football. Now, that doesn't mean you can't turn it over quick. We saw an example of Mel Tucker doing that this year with the transfer portal and new signees. But it has made it a more difficult job, I think, at the college level.
The great Brady Quin, always kind enough to give us a couple of minutes here on the Armani and Edwards program. Brady, thanks so much, my man. We really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Brady.
Thank you, guys.
I know one thing we can agree on is that Brady has the best hair there is, man.
Oh, he's the best.
That's the one thing we can agree on. He has the best hair. And his knowledge is always...
You look pretty good, though, Brady.
No, man.
Come on.
I fell in comparison.
Thanks, Brady.
See you, BQ.
All right, BQ. You've reached the end of the video. You know what you should do? Press like. You know you like the content that we have here at Woodward Sports Network. I'm Braylon Edwards from the bottom line. Subscribe to us right now.